It's the evening of the 22nd of March 1967, Studio 2 at Abbey Road. The recording of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper LP is in its 6th month. Joss sticks are burning in the corner of the studio and rugs are being found to make everyone feel comfortable. The other Beatles are watching, but not taking part. This is very much George's world. When Sgt. Pepper was released in June 1967, Within You, Without You stood out. George's biographer, Graeme Thomson.
It's an assertion really of his independence and his self-awareness and his growing strength within the band. And that's a song that has no real relationship with the concept of Sgt. Pepper, musically or lyrically. It stands very much on its own. And I think it's a very impressive piece of work.
3 years later, George Harrison was back at Abbey Road recording an album that was to be his biggest musical declaration of independence yet. All Things Must Pass would become a #1 album across the world.
He was always sullen, he always held back, he didn't buy in.
Even to mention the word God or Lord would make people's hair curl.
I just thinking of a way of how to get everybody singing Hallelujah, 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 and then suddenly shove Hare Krishna in and catch them before they realised.
The first thing I really heard, I think, was My Sweet Lord. And I thought that was one of the best songs that I'd ever heard, ever.
It's very raw, it's very straight, very honest, and it puts us in a position that we rarely get to be in, which is the inside of a superstar's head.
Well, that band, dang, man, the best band there was in the world, and I was part of it.
Growing up in the 1970s, I was aware of George Harrison and his interest in Indian classical music, particularly his close connection with Panditji Ravi Shankar and spirituality. I knew this wasn't common amongst bands or pop musicians that I was familiar with. I got to know more about George's life and even met him in the 1990s. I knew his hit singles, but his most famous album, All Things Must Pass, remained unexplored. Was this LP, written in the latter years of the 1960s, already out of date by 1970? Or was All Things Must Pass, in fact, ahead of its time, with its heartfelt lyrics and religious themes? This month sees the 50th anniversary of its release, and it's a good time to reappraise George Harrison's most successful album.
Baby's good to me, you know she's happy, asking me, you know, no.
George joined the Beatles in 1958, aged just 15, the youngest in the band. Within only 5 years, they were the biggest group in the world. But the quiet one, as the press dubbed him, enjoyed the attention least of all. Bob Geldof went to see the Beatles when they played Dublin in November 1963. He could see even then that George set himself apart. Here he's speaking in 2001.
He looked great, he was skeleton thin. I mean, he was pre-Keith, his look, you know, and George was back behind them and just standing in the middle and just staring, like, almost disdainfully. And you pick up on that. I mean, and then when he sang, you know, his mouth went off to the side, that really cool thing. But he didn't smile at all in the 20 minutes they were on stage. But he was always sullen, he always held back, he didn't buy in. I think against John and Paul, you have to plough your own furrow, especially if you've got ambitions to compete with them. You know, there was just no way. How do you get a look in?
George's biographer, Graeme Thomson.
Initially, I think they were very dismissive of George as a songwriter, and they kind of indulged him as very much the third wheel. He was kind of the baby brother of the band. You know, they certainly loved him and they appreciated what he brought as a musician and a guitar player, but he wasn't really taken seriously as a writer. Lennon and McCartney were always, they were so creative and so wrapped up in their own material, you know, that was always going to come first, and George was a kind of interesting diversion, but it took a long time for them to take him seriously.
Here comes the sun, here comes the sun, I say it's all right.
Well, even when I did get songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun in, I always had to do, you know, about 10 of Paul and John's songs before they'd, you know, give me the break.
Michael Palin became a good friend of George in the 1970s.
He talked about the Beatles quite a lot. you know, you talk about the creative process, talk about how easy, how difficult it was to write, how much was communally written, how much was individually written. It was clear that, you know, he felt stifled, I think, by the creative tyros of Lennon and McCartney, and didn't really feel that he had developed as much as he wanted to as a musician himself.
What do you think is the biggest misunderstanding people have about George?
That he's the silent Beatle. He never stopped talking once he was in full flow. He wasn't silent at all. He was extraordinarily busy and coming up with ideas constantly.
The one time I met George myself, he was passionate and excited to hear the extraordinary Indian classical guitar technique of U. Srinivas at the live concert we both attended at London's South Bank Centre. After the concert, we both went backstage, and George's curiosity and sense of deep respect for Srinivas's technique and artistry was both infectious and inspiring. He certainly seemed far from quiet, as was his reputation when it came to music he loved. By the end of the 1960s, George was in full flow, writing dozens of songs. Some, like Here Comes the Sun and Something, became massive hits, but many others were left unrecorded. George spoke to DJ Annie Nightingale in 1977.
It was always said that you felt a certain amount of frustration within the Beatles because you weren't getting as much of your material across as perhaps you'd like to have done.
Yeah, that was difficult, particularly towards the last few years when I was writing a lot of songs, John and Paul continued writing, and Ringo also started writing a few more. And it was difficult, you know, an album had average about 12 titles on it, and it was hard to get songs in. That's why All Things Must Pass had so many on it, because it was like being constipated for years and suddenly being able to let loose, you know.
By early 1970, the Beatles were effectively over, so George decided that he would record a solo album with Phil Spector, as he'd recently overseen the Beatles' Let It Be album. George played him the tunes he'd written. Graeme Thomson.
Well, Phil Spector recollects hearing all of the songs pretty much that ended up on All Things Must Pass in fairly stark embryonic versions. And, you know, the quote he said was, "It was endless, and each one was better than the last."
It's called Run of the Mill, this one.
Take one.
Everyone has choice when to and not to raise the voices. It's you that decides.
There was just this kind of outpouring of music, and they're very beautiful versions, you know, mainly acoustic. Some of them have some bass and some drums from Ringo on them.
So I must be on my way. Face another day.
I think, you know, he had hit a really rich seam of songwriting form by that point. It was a continuation of Here Comes the Sun, Something. He was really peaking, I suppose. The material was very much in shape.
Anything you want to change or say?
George started recruiting musicians to play on his album. Top keyboard player Bobby Whitlock was staying with George's friend Eric Clapton in the spring of 1970.
When Eric and I were having lunch one day and the phone rang and he picked it up, and it was only the second time I'd ever known him to use the phone. But he picked up the phone and he was going, yeah, we can do that. Let me talk to Bobby about it. He hung up, and I said, what was that? And he said, that was George. He wants to know if we'll put together a band and be the core band for his new solo record. And so I said, oh, that's great, you know.
There's difficult things about not being in a band, and at the same time, there's good points because you can mix with more musicians, different people, whereas we got a little stagnant by all those years just playing the four of us together, and it was hard to get anybody else to play with us.
The Beatles had always recorded their albums as a tight unit. George wanted to try something new. Graeme Thomson.
He brought in all his musical friends to play. Sometimes 5 of them were playing the same rhythm guitar part. It wasn't really about always what they brought musically. It was about creating a kind of communal sense of well-being in an atmosphere, but it wasn't a kind of free-for-all. It was quite disciplined in that respect. It was just that he wanted, I think, probably the support of a lot of his friends, so he didn't feel too exposed, and he wanted them to be a part of this. And of course that contributed to that enormous sound that's on that record, because there's just simply so many people playing on it.
Before we even started recording anything, we started jamming. And that was kind of a getting to know you thing. So we're all that one thing, and we're all that one soul. So, but it was like getting to know everybody.
The so-called Apple Jams would become the third disc of the All Things Must Pass album. Drummer Alan White had recently played with the Plastic Ono Band and on Lennon's single Instant Karma.
John was very forthright and he knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he was very set in his mind about what the song should sound about. He had a sense of authority about him. George was a little bit like meandering along with everybody in the room and making all the things work. And we get there every day, and George would say, "Alan, I want you to play drums on this one." And you know, he'd go around the room like that. Luckily, most of the band never changed every day. It was a very kind of communal situation, like a lot of things were with the Beatles at that time. All the sessions for Imagine were the same thing. You were kind of part of a family. Everybody would have a chore to do, and we'd get it done by the evening.
It strikes me that George's more egalitarian approach to record making was something new. This is not an artist employing session musicians. This is a collection of some of George's favourite musicians assembled in one room, making music in true collaboration. Of the 17 songs on All Things Must Pass, 7 tackle faith and spirituality head-on. George's interest in religion began in 1965 in an unorthodox way. I spoke to George's widow, Olivia.
He would always say, "My wife doesn't like to hear me say this," but it's true. He had an LSD experience, and he said somewhere in his head, he just heard yogis of the Himalayas. He just heard this thing. He said, "I'd never thought about yogis of the Himalayas before." And shortly after that, he met Ravi Shankar, and Ravi gave him the book Autobiography of a Yogi about Paramahansa Yogananda, and he read that book, which is really it can be a life-changing book. And I think that was sort of like, oh, so that's what yogis of the Himalayas are. And Ravi and George became dear friends and collaborators and soulmates. And Ravi really took him on a trip, and he got answers to every one of his questions, you know, somehow through whether it would be a book, Ramakrishna or Vivekananda, or going to temples and really experiencing the fervor and a different spiritual path.
Jools Holland was George's friend and collaborator.
I think when he went to India and his friendship with Ravi, I think opened his eyes to a lot of different stylings and realised it didn't all have to be boom splat. Boom splat being a boom, ta, boom, ta, boom, boom. Although he was one of the best people at having that style of music too. It wasn't like one precluded the others, but I think he embraced and learned a great deal and was from that. Because I suppose also essentially he was very open to sort of new ideas while retaining his sort of core just musicality, which was him, which was sort of a fantastic rhythm and blues guitar player.
Panditji Ravi Shankar was a musician I listened to from a very early age. His influence on Indian classical music cannot be overstated. Here's a man who could collaborate with the likes of Sir Yehudi Menuhin back in the 1950s and perform at huge festivals like Woodstock as an artist in his own right. Panditji Ravi Shankar had an incredibly brilliant mathematical mind that allowed him to bring out the inherent complexities of Indian classical time cycles, as well as a tone that had been influenced by such luminaries as classical guitarist André Segovia, who he'd met in Paris earlier in his life.
Ours is an oral tradition. It's not a written down music as in the West. But the beginning can be compared same as the Western classical, because we have to do a lot of scale practices, just the technique of it, like etc. And these are simple things, a lot of exercises and things like that.
Panditji Ravi Shankar's imagination as an Indian classical musician was unparalleled in how he was able to apply his knowledge to collaboration across many different art forms. I believe this openness and ability to transcend the traditional boundaries of his art form probably inspired George Harrison's fearless approach to time signatures and unique melodic movement in his own work. Decades before the term world music was coined, George Harrison was finding his own unique global musical expression. In February 1968, at the suggestion of George, all four Beatles flew to Rishikesh in the foothills of the Himalayas to study yoga and meditation at the feet of a guru they had met in London, the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi.
Every man should be aware that it is very easy for everyone to take his mind deep within the thinking process and thereby expand the capacity of the conscious mind and improve his efficiency in thinking and in action.
Biographer of George Harrison and an instructor in Hinduism, Joshua Greene.
You have to imagine the scene, right? They show up in India. If you haven't been to India, you can't understand how different it is from anything that we identify with here in the West. When you wake up in Rishikesh, there are dozens of ashrams all around you, all up and down the banks of the Ganges and going up into the Himalayas. And you're hearing these spiritual sounds, the chanting of Om, and Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare. You're hearing this around you all day long. George found that there wasn't just this thing in isolation that he was learning from Ravi Shankar, but that there was an entire ancient tradition, a whole history of spirituality behind it. And that was very important to him. And when he came back from Rishikesh, he was looking for more. Now his spiritual engines are really revved up. And because the other Beatles weren't as curious about it as he was looking for good sangha, good spiritual company.
Graeme Thomson.
He was a deep thinker, he embraced solitude. It's interesting, the first song he wrote for the Beatles was called Don't Bother Me, Leave Me Alone. And I always thought that's quite emblematic of his character. I think you do have to see his very kind of deep immersion into spirituality as, in some ways, a reaction to Beatlemania and to the extremities of fame. I think one may not have happened without the other, at least not in the way that it did.
George speaking in 1967.
All the papers, they think it's a passing fad. It's another thing like flower power and all that rubbish. But in actual fact, this is something that, we're going to be doing this for the rest of our lives, and I'm still going to be believing in it when I'm 90, if I live that long.
George immersed himself in the Hare Krishna movement, helping them buy a temple in central London. Joshua Greene was a young devotee.
I get to London. I visit the temple on Bury Place, just off Oxford Street. I walk in. The devotees are there serving lunch, a beautiful vegetarian meal. They ask me about myself. I say, well, I'm studying. I play organ in a college band. Really, they say, come with us. We barrel into this Volkswagen minibus, which was the most dangerous vehicle ever allowed on the roads. We show up 5 minutes later, the door opens, and there I see a big number 3 on the door. It's 3 Savile Row. It's Apple Corps. It's Beatles headquarters. And saying, my gosh, what are we doing here? We walk in, and because they knew that I played organ in a college band, they hand me a harmonium, this hand-pumped organ. And there's George Harrison in the recording studio. Skinny as a string bean, hair down to his waist. He's got neck beads on, indicating he's a devotee of Krishna. And George comes over and says, well, just play along, So I sit down and I'm pumping away. I'm jamming away on this harmonium as George is recording Govinda Jaya Jaya Gopala Jaya Jaya. And I'm thinking to myself, if I stay with these people, I get God and the Beatles. Okay, I'm in.
Govindam Adi Purusham Kamaham Bhajami Govindam
Govinda and the Hare Krishna mantra, produced by George Harrison and performed by the Radhana Krishna Temple, were both top 30 hits. Meanwhile, more than ever, religious themes were infusing the songs George was writing for the Beatles. Even his most popular and most covered hit, Something, was written as both a song about Krishna and his first wife, Patty. But other tracks, such as All Things Must Pass, were considered by John and Paul not good enough to make it onto a Beatles album. A frustrated George began to stockpile them for his own solo record, over which he would call the shots. One of the songs he kept for himself would become the first single from All Things Must Pass.
My Sweet Lord.
I'd followed the Beatles all the way through their career and their different albums, and then when they kind of split up, it was quite upsetting because you thought, what's going to happen now? And then I remember when All Things Must Pass came out, the first thing I really heard, I think, was My Sweet Lord, and I thought that was one of the best songs that I'd ever heard, ever.
My sweet Lord, my Lord, my Lord, I really want to see you, really want to be with you.
The song was written at the end of 1969, when George was on tour with American duo Delaney and Bonnie.
He was touring around Britain with his friends and popping up and playing guitar. And this song popped out on the bus. And I think one of the big songs at that time was Oh Happy Day, that great kind of pop gospel song. And that had a direct influence, I think, on the sound of My Sweet Lord.
My Sweet Lord was as much a hymn as a pop song. George knew it was a brave thing to release. Olivia Harrison.
He said even to mention the word God or Lord would make people's hair curl, or hair curl, as they used to say.
You know, at the time it was so popular and it was also very controversial, and the subject matter is not something that you normally hear, people sing records like that unless it's gospel choirs or something. It had so much response from people on a spiritual level. Many people have written to me over the years saying, thanks for doing that song because that helped me to do this or go to join the Krishnas or whatever, or just look into myself a bit more.
I wanted to know from keyboard player Bobby Whitlock whether the recording of the song was at all a spiritual experience.
It was a straightforward rock and roll session. There was no religion involved. As a matter of fact, I sang on My Sweet Lord, I sang the second part harmony in the backgrounds, and that's just George and me singing those things. And he had written out, Krishna, Krishna, Adu, Bala, and all these different things. Well, I asked him, I said, what are all of these? What are these? He said, they're all different connotation names for God. But I didn't know it. See, I was a Baptist preacher's son, and when I left that behind me, that's where it stayed.
I just thinking of a way of how to combine Hallelujah and Hare Krishna, which is just simplistically, it's the West and the East, and how to get everybody singing Hallelujah, 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 and then suddenly shove Hare Krishna in and catch them before they realised.
Joshua Greene.
Injecting a Sanskrit prayer, and not just a line, but the entire prayer, into a pop tune has got to be one of the bravest things that's ever been undertaken in the history of rock and roll. And thank goodness the fans picked up on what he was doing, and it became his signature song, and a beautiful one.
Alan White played drums on My Sweet Lord. For him, it proved to be a memorable, if awkward, experience.
I remember Ringo was in the studio that day, and the drum part's it's not complicated, and it's a basic rhythm most of the way through. And George said, Alan, I want you to play drums on this. And I said, well, Ringo's standing, why didn't you get Ringo to play? And George said, no, Alan, I want you to play drums, and Ringo can play tambourine. And I felt a little bit awkward, but I guess that's what George wanted me to do. So I ended up in the booth with a drum kit, and Reno was on the other side playing tambourine. I was going, this is kind of a little bit uneasy, but we just got on with it and just played it.
Not all the songs on All Things Must Pass are as joyful as My Sweet Lord. It's an album of contrasts. George wasn't afraid to tackle difficult themes. Side 3 starts with the song Beware of Darkness. Joshua Greene.
This is still the early years of George's spiritual journey. So a lot of his songs, even While My Guitar Gently Weeps, are reflections on how sad the world is. And he's alerting people here in Beware of Darkness that this is a world of suffering, and be careful that you don't fall into despondency over that. You know, beware of darkness, watch out, now take care. Beware of the thoughts that linger winding up inside your head. Beware of sadness. He didn't want people to think that there's no alternative, there's no other place to turn. He knew there was. He knew that there is a transcendent reality. And if you turn your eyes that way, the clouds part and there's something else to see in life.
Watch out now, take up your word.
Bobby Whitlock played piano on the track.
George came in and he says, "Hey, Bobby, your dad was a minister, wasn't he?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Come on in here." And he said, "I want you to play on something." And grand piano was in the big studio, and it was Beware of Darkness. I don't know if it was hitting it too hard or it was a lower bass C. And as soon as I hit that thing, the string broke and went all through the piano, you know, right in the middle of like the first take. The whole dang thing comes to a stop. And they had to get a guy in there to put another string on. You can hear it. You can actually hear that the clarity of the bass end, you know. So breaking the string was probably a good thing.
Michael Palin.
I have to be honest, I was slightly wary of the Indian mysticism coming in because I didn't understand it properly at the time there. And I thought George is putting something in between us and the music, you know, this his own sort of philosophy. And gradually I realized this was something he believed in very strongly and which very much affected the sound of the album as well. And it's something a bit like the earlier Beatles albums. You had to put something in to it while listening to them. You couldn't just sort of lap it up like an ordinary pop record and say, "Oh, we know what this is, it's more of the same." There were different ideas and concepts and feelings and, if you like, an intellectual approach behind it all, which was very, very different. So one had to take all that in and listen properly.
What Michael says is fascinating. I've come to realise that George's interest in the spiritual is one of the things that makes All Things Must Pass ahead of its time. He took religion seriously. Christian gospel had been a part of popular music from its birth, but to include Eastern religion was revolutionary. In the West in the 60s, the sitar was a short-lived fad, and for many their interest in yoga and chanting was just as fleeting. But for George Harrison, it stuck. I asked Olivia Harrison what was her favourite track on the album.
I've always said my favorite song is Run of the Mill. You know, there's a lot of advice and instruction in here without George intentionally trying to preach. He was really talking to himself, accepting responsibility for your actions, especially in those closing lines. How high will you leap? Will you make enough for you to reap it? Only you will arrive at your own made end with no one but yourself to be offended. It's you that decides. You know, whether you believe in karma or not, we all know that our actions rebound. And that's a difficult thing to express and he was 27 years old or maybe younger, actually, when he started writing this album.
I would say in the record business, a producer is probably equal to what a director is in film. bringing the best out of the artist, bringing the best out of the music, bringing the best out of the song.
The early sessions at Abbey Road for All Things Must Pass were produced by Phil Spector. He was famously eccentric. George's biographer, Graeme Thomson.
It was an interesting choice, Phil Spector. He was someone who was kind of beloved of the Beatles. You know, those early girl group records that he made were really beloved of the band. And of course, they covered a few of them in sort of gender swap versions, which are very good fun in the early days. Lennon had brought him in to work on Let It Be, much to the chagrin of Paul McCartney. He'd done Instant Karma recently with John Lennon. So he was kind of the flavour of the month among that side of the Beatles. So I just think, he admired him. He wanted somebody, I think, who was not associated with the Beatles records prior to that. Someone who he admired, who had a very distinctive sound. Wow Wow was one of the first songs they tried on the album, and it came back with this enormous kind of... Well, Phil Spector did a wall of sound. This was in excelsis. It was absolutely swathed in reverb and echo, and Harrison was kind of aghast at this. He found it was far too much.
Phil Spector interviewed in the early 1970s.
I don't know who invented the name Wall of Sound. It was to try to put as much on the tape and break every tradition, condition, and everything else that was believed in by the business. I guess I have learned what the Wall of Sound is, but the Wall of Sound was something inside of me, and it just had to please me. It had to please me.
Well, in those days, it was like the reverb was kind of used a bit more than what I would do now. In fact, I don't use reverb at all. I can't stand it. But at the time, I did the record with Phil Spector, and we did it like Phil Spector would do it. It's hard to go back to anything 30 years later and expect it to be how you would want it now. I dare say if I did a record today in 30 years, I probably would want to change it.
Drummer Alan White had worked with Phil Spector on John Lennon's single Instant Karma, and he found Spector always up for ideas.
It was a big band type sound every time you played in the studio. It was great. And we went in the control room quite a few times. And Phil would be sitting there in the producer's chair and, just analysing everything and bouncing off ideas with each other. And like in Imagine, I told him that John should start the song by himself. And John said, that's not a bad idea. So that's eventually what happened with the song Imagine. So you would put comments into what you were doing to try and help the song.
Spector and Harrison were an odd pairing, but it worked. Laid-back Harrison directed the musicians on the studio floor, whilst aloof and paranoid Spector stayed in the control room. Harrison would calm his producer down when the unexpected happened, like when a string section downed tools for a tea break. "Don't worry, Phil, it's an English thing," George explained. Bobby Whitlock.
Phil was a funny dude, I tell you right now. They should have had been recording and videoing what was going on in the control room. Because that's where he stayed, and that's where a producer's supposed to stay. They're not supposed to be out there trying to tell you what to do. They're supposed to be up there making sure it all goes down on the tape. I was glad that he didn't try to mingle, because he was in his own world. He was in a bubble. He could be in a room full of 100 people, and he would still be isolated because he was in a bubble. It was all about himself. He was upset that they wouldn't let him bring a gun into England, But he, you don't need any guns to do what we were doing. Nobody knew who he was or could care less anyway, But he was a paranoid little fella.
Although Spector's relationship with guns would have a tragic end nearly 40 years later when he was convicted of murder, in 1970 it was just a part of his eccentricity. Graeme Thomson.
He seemed quite overawed by the scale of the whole thing, actually. He wasn't in control of a lot of these musicians. He didn't know them. He was quite withdrawn. He was quite quiet. And for a while that seemed to work quite well, and then it didn't. And, Spector bailed on the project halfway through. He was ill. I think he was drinking too much, and he went back to LA. So, from July 1970 onwards, for most of the rest of the project, George was really producing it himself.
For me, the absence of Phil Spector on some tracks helps give the album a contemporary feel. Too much Wall of Sound would have rooted it firmly in the 1960s. Songs like Behind That Locked Door benefited from a simpler production.
Why are you still crying? The rain is now through. Please forget those teardrops. Let me take them from you.
At the end of each late-night session, George would return to his newly acquired home, a massive 19th century Gothic mansion called Friar Park, built by an eccentric Victorian lawyer named Sir Frank Crisp. Having been there myself a few years ago, I can describe it as a magnificent estate with an incredibly beautiful landscape garden and stunning mansion, the highlight of which was George's own room of guitars and mandolins. These remain beautifully and elegantly arranged, so they still feel ready to play at any given moment. Michael Palin.
It's a very, very strange, silly, wonderful, over-the-top piece of translating kind of mischief into great architecture. And the man, Frank Crisp, who built it, sort of, it was a kind of playground for his ideas. I mean, no one else would have built a Matterhorn in the back garden and things like that. George is possibly the only person I know who could have restored that house to the way it was originally intended.
Bobby Whitlock stayed at Friar Park with George and his first wife Patty just before recording All Things Must Pass. It gave him an insight into how George viewed his time with the Beatles.
They were doing one room at a time in the big house because it was a wreck when he bought it. We were in a dining room and it had built-in chest, you know, where they kept all the dishes and everything. And he pulled up one of the bottom drawers one time and it was full of gold albums and singles and stuff, and Help, and every one of them. I was looking at that, and I went, that has got to be really, really cool, you know, be able to put all of that stuff away in the dark and not have that define who you are.
George wrote a song on All Things Must Pass as a tribute to Friar Park's original owner. Ballad of Sir Frankie Crisp is a whimsical guided tour of the house and grounds.
I think it gave him space, you know, creative space to get away from. I mean, I've seen so many pictures of him standing at the door of the house he was living in before he moved here, standing alongside fans, being very generous, and somebody knocking on his door and taking photographs. There's so many pictures of people, and that didn't happen here. He used to say in Liverpool at 6 o'clock they would close the parks, and the parkie would be kicking them out. And his father told me, he said, when he was small, he said, one day I'm going to get my own park. And so the Ballad of Sir Frankie Crisp, it's just, you know, I think about it all the time.
Although George sang about the importance of the spiritual world, his purchase of Friar Park and his love of fast cars showed he also had a love for the material world. Money preoccupied him. After all, he wrote the 1965 song Taxman whilst a member of the biggest group on the planet. This seeming contradiction was a criticism that dogged him his whole life. Graeme Thomson thinks that All Things Must Pass addresses that question.
That record is so interesting, the whole album, is because it's a kind of conversation with George between, you know, the rock and roll life and the spiritual life. When we talk about George being a contradictory character, and he certainly was, it's almost not the point. The point is that he knew that, and he was always striving to be a better person. And I think that's what you hear in a lot of those songs on that record.
His spiritual sort of development in India and all that underlay everything, I think, but gave him a certain sort of comfortable looseness once he felt that he knew basically what life was about and how life should be lived and how we should approach this world and all the opportunities it has and all the sort of difficulties it has. There was a kind of base there on which he could just bounce off and do all sorts of other things. I don't think driving very, very fast cars prevented him from also enjoying, you know, just the peace and calm of meditation.
He was a witness to his actions. He always said, you know, people think they've found me or found something out about me. It's like that I don't know. I know when I'm bad. I know, you know, like nobody suffers more than yourself, right? Than oneself when you know you're not being true. And that he tormented himself, you know, I think a lot. But he was a curious guy and he just wanted to have all experiences and hope he could get back in time for the big exit.
The recording of All Things Must Pass took 5 months to complete. Some of his favourite musicians worked on the album, like Eric Clapton, Billy Preston and Gary Brooker. Drummer Alan White and guitarist Dave Mason knew it was special, and they'd worked with John Lennon and Jimi Hendrix.
There was a lot going on in that studio. It was great to be part of it. They were all had some success in their own right, so they all were, you know, it was like having a super band.
The sense of like you were working. You never had a sense of that. You went in there with a sense of excitement on producing a great piece of music that would be heard forever.
Keyboard player Bobby Whitlock.
George would come around and play the song for us, but we all heard it once and made our little notes, and then we did it. But we didn't do it by charging ahead full of steam. We did it by listening, you know, and it all came together. You can hear how delicate all that album is. But with that band, dang, man, the best band there was in the world was right there, and I was a part of it.
The sessions were occasionally interrupted. John Lennon turned up and George played him highlights of what they'd recorded over the past few months. Lennon loved what he heard, to George's delight. Other interruptions were more unexpected.
We'd be right in the middle of a take, and those hairy Christians with bald heads and ponytails would burst through the doors. I don't even know how they got in, but they managed to get in. And they burst through the doors clanging little bells and throwing rose petals everywhere, and they brought peanut butter cookies and everything. It was an experience, I got to tell you right now. We'd have to put the brakes on, you know, until they got through clanging and banging around, you know.
One of the more serious reasons that the album took 5 months to record was because Harold and Louise Harrison, George's parents, were unwell. Biographer Graeme Thomson.
Once you realise that both of his parents were very ill at this time, you know, it casts a more poignant light on a lot of the concerns in All Things Must Pass, and a lot of the way it looks at mortality and life. Around that time, his mother was diagnosed with a brain tumour, and she died quite quickly after that. His father was also ill, you know, he had ulcers and stomach problems. So it's a really difficult time, allied to the fact that the Beatles are ending, this, you know, other great relationship in his life, which is fractured. So he's got a lot to deal with at this time. I do think when you listen to songs like All Things Must Pass, you suddenly understand this is not just a kind of airy-fairy rock star pontificating about spiritual matters. It's actually something quite deeply profound as a way of dealing with what's going on in his own life at that time, and particularly the decline of his mother, who he was very, very close to. So it is a personal record in that respect as well.
Finally, after 5 months and thousands of pounds of studio costs, George realised that enough was enough. Here he is speaking in early 2001.
Well, when I started the album, I was just trying to do a record, and I had so many songs that I just recorded one after the other and just kept doing backing tracks. And one day I thought, I better check out what's going on here, and I had 18 tracks. Also, the accountant at Abbey Road came down the stairs and said, "Is this record going to take much longer?" So I thought, well, I think that's probably enough, and decided to put them all out at once.
All Things Must Pass was released on the 30th of November 1970. It came as a triple album in a hinge box, just like a classical record release, with a large poster of George. On the cover, he is sitting in his garden at Friar Park in a pair of Wellington boots surrounded by 4 gnomes, which may or may not have represented the Beatles. Graeme Thomson.
He seems kind of emancipated in a strange way. You know, he's presenting himself at last as himself, this eccentric, kind of funny, strange country squire. And so it is a sense that we're seeing George Harrison for the first time. So, I mean, I think all of that plays into the uniqueness and the success of the record.
Jeff Lynne of ELO speaking in 2001.
I was totally amazed by it, especially by the front cover with him in his wellies, you know. I thought that was really funny. It was astonishing, especially the opening, like 3 or 4 tracks, because they were so powerful and big and great chords. All lovely tunes, totally memorable. You know, a great piece of work, I would say.
Olivia Harrison.
I just found my original copy in my parents' house in their record collection. And I just found the scotch-taped corners trying to hold the box together, and my sisters claiming it after I left. And it was a really seminal, important album for me in my life. And I wanted everyone to hear it. I thought it was expressing what we were, you know, the sort of quest we were all beginning at that time.
It's received critically extremely well, with a degree of surprise as well, I think. You know, George, although he was emerging in the Beatles, I don't think anyone expected this kind of statement on this scale. So it's critically acclaimed, and it's a commercial juggernaut. You know, it spends 8 weeks at #1 in Britain, 7 weeks in the US. My Sweet Lord is also at #1 on both sides of the Atlantic. So he is, at this period, and I think probably for the next year, he's probably the biggest solo star on the planet, George Harrison. It's an incredible thing.
George Harrison never again matched the success of All Things Must Pass, although the hits returned in the 1980s with his album Cloud 9 and his work with the Travelling Wilburys. In 1997, George was diagnosed with throat cancer. The following July, Michael Palin visited him at Friar Park and wrote about it in his diary.
On the broad green sloping curve of grass, as we shuffle about trying to find patches of sunlight coming through the trees, he launches into a long description of what he calls, with a rueful smile, my little brush with cancer. George leavens all this with his Indian wisdoms about the transience of this bodily life. We've always been here and always will be here. It seems every corner and every detail of Friar Park is preoccupying him. George admits that the Matterhorn's not in great shape and the rockery is a wilderness. But he's had carpenters build a small Russian dasher, complete with onion dome and cross, and a ring of stones he calls Friar Henge. We end the evening sitting near Friar Henge, whilst George stokes a campfire. It's extraordinary in a way, this restless, creative, inventive, multi-millionaire ending up, happy as Larry, sitting round a fire of twigs and branches.
I'm very sad, devastated. We've known he's been ill for a long time, and just very sad to hear that he's passed on. He's a lovely man. I love him dearly. I grew up with him, and I like to remember all the great times we had together. I understand, as I say, he went peacefully, and so that's a blessing.
George died as a relatively young man. He was only 58. And although, in a way, we saw it coming, you know, he had had a number of tussles in the years before that were well documented. So there wasn't the shock that there was attached to John Lennon, which of course came out of a clear blue sky. But there was a huge amount of sadness. My Sweet Lord went back to #1, so that was the kind of musical side of things. There were crowds at Abbey Road and crowds at Friar Park. There were some lovely things written in the newspapers. But of course he was one of the 4 icons of the 60s, and that never left. And I think his death was an opportunity for people to reflect on their own selves and their own pasts.
There's a song on the fourth side of All Things Must Pass called The Art of Dying. I asked Olivia if in the last days of George's life it became significant.
He certainly wasn't thinking about that song, but he was, you know, thinking about death. I wouldn't say any more than anybody else, but he thought about it in a way like, what's going to happen? It really meant a lot to him to be able to leave his body in a conscious manner. You can't just remember at the end of your life, you want to remember your higher self, the higher things. But you have to practice, because if you don't practice, that's not going to be what you remember when you're dying. You're going to be thinking, did I put out the cat? And I don't want to be thinking that. You know, I want to be thinking of something higher. And that was a goal of his. So the art of dying, you know, there is an art to it.
50 years on, All Things Must Pass could sound dated. Instead, it sounds fresh and contemporary. George's collaborative approach to this recording, the fact that his songs tackled life and death issues instead of just boy meets girl, his respect for religion and for the music of other cultures, all mean that as an LP, it was ahead of its time. Jools Holland.
I think as a songwriter, he really is extraordinary, because you're talking about the different tracks on All Things Must Pass. You know, some of them really are quite experimental. At the time, people might have said, oh, I'm a bit worried about that. You know, we're just having our fish finger sandwiches tonight, and we don't really know if we like this, and we've got our Ford console and our black and white telly. This is like kind of a bit challenging as an idea. And then they kind of settled into it and thought, well, actually, it's quite good, this. Now, look at you and you listen to them. They sound actually really much more contemporary than anything. They sound like they could have been made yesterday by somebody who was doing something great.
Biographer of George Harrison and an instructor in Hinduism, Joshua Greene.
Along comes George. Let's harmonize the Western music language that we know and love with this deeper message from Bhagavad Gita. It was inspiring. It was energizing. It really was a feeling that maybe there's hope for the world. If this message of the divinity of all life can be brought into something that's so popular that it's on every radio station, okay, maybe there's some hope for the world.
Graeme Thomson.
All Things Must Pass in the kind of overview is really an extraordinary response to fame and wealth and a fork in the road of someone's life. He is unimaginably rich and famous, and yet there's a huge void in the middle of his life. And those songs, I think, try and ask the how and the why and the what next and the where next in a very honest and beautiful way. It's a very personal record. It's also stuffed full of just amazingly good songs. I do think you can listen to it purely on a kind of surface level and get an enormous amount out of it. But if you dig a little bit deeper, it's very raw, it's very straight, very honest. And it puts us in a position that we rarely get to be in, which is the inside of a superstar's head when they're not satisfied with what all the things they wanted have brought them. And so they're asking, well, what else is there?
He would never say he was proud of anything that he did, but I know he was happy that this one, you know, we could use the word proud. Let's use it.
That was all. Then it's finished.